So today, I'm going to get to talk about my creative process, and hopefully it will coincide with some of your creative processes. So I'm starting back in 1972. I immigrated together with a group of fellow art students from Philadelphia, PA, Tyler School of Art, to Hastings, Ontario. We landed in this small rural community where we had purchased a farm together. We had no idea where we were. We opened a gallery called the Conqueror Worm to show our work. Hastings is known for its good fishing, and we began to realize where we were when people showed up looking for fishing bait from the Conqueror Worm Gallery. And what was all this other stuff around? The land and textiles are what I work with. And for me, clotheslines are textile installations on the land. The women who hung this line thought about size and shape and color and many of the things that we think about as artists. This is a view out my front window, and I began to appreciate the lines and patterns that farmers draw into the earth and notice the grid configuration and the larger divisions on the land. At that time, I was driving to my studio 45 minutes, and I found myself stopping along the way to walk in the fields, draw, photograph, and collect. These were my first experiences of coming to know a place through my work. Touching and gathering formed a literal connection between myself and the place. Collected material was brought back to the studio and incorporated into some of the early work. Jumping ahead to 1986, I was invited to submit a commission proposal for a piece for the lobby of the Red Deer Arts and Theater Center in Alberta. I didn't know anything about doing commissions, so I decided to approach it like as if I were taking a course and learn as much as I could about the process. This was the maquette that I submitted. But before we made our proposals, the organization brought the 3 individual artists out to see the space. As the 3 of us stood and looked at this large brick wall, one of the artists commented, "My only problem is I have so many ideas." And I was staring at this big brick wall going, "Oh my God, I don't have one idea." And I got kind of depressed, but then I thought about how I usually approach my work, and I realized I needed to get out and see the land in that area. So I canceled my plane ticket and borrowed a bicycle and took off on a bike trip. At the local tourist office where I went to get maps, I saw these aerial photographs on the wall. I was taken by the strong grid pattern and the natural land formations that flow over it. I found out where the photographs were from and contacted them about the project. A stack of photos were waiting for me in the mail when I arrived home. I worked with these to develop the fabric for the piece. And this is a very interesting Landsat image of the border between Alberta and Montana. The difference in farming policies in the 2 countries is visually dramatic. So I did get to do the commission, and one of the most satisfying aspects of the project was working with 3 local quilting groups. Each one did the quilting on one of the panels. Women never get paid for this kind of labor and skill. So with funds from the commission, it felt good to be able to pay them very well for their part in this piece. I love this picture. Each panel is 20 feet high and 18 feet wide. I assured the quilters that they didn't need to make those tiny little stitches, that the 3 layers just needed to be held together in some way. Of course, when I went to look at the progress of the piece, these skilled women had made beautiful, tiny little stitches. And I learned the importance of honoring their skill. I worked with one assistant, that's Kathy, she's on the ladder. This is during the installation of the piece. The fabric for the 3 panels is made of wax resist and discharged cotton. Gold leaf was applied to pick up the different qualities of light throughout the day as the sun passed over the skylight above it. The entire piece is 20 feet by 50 feet and has 45 steamed bent sticks that float between the panels to give a sense of floating over the landscape. The zigzag pattern at the bottom was taken off the only decorative element on the outside of the building. The architect, Arthur Erickson, had made a delicate border around the top by setting the bricks on edge in such a way that the shadow created a zigzag pattern. I thought it would be fun to blow that up to human height on the inside of the building. So after working with those quilters, I wanted to devote a period of time to studying quilts. A research grant gave me the opportunity to work with quilt collections in 2 museums, the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto and the Museum of Civilization in Hull, Quebec. I discovered that I was drawn to the quilts constructed from fabric that had a previous history. And it occurred to me that it was at the juncture when fabric becomes useless that women were able to become creative with that fabric. That's where quilts happen. That's where the different other aspects of fabric became more artistic. Anyway, one of the special characteristics of cloth is that it wears out and breaks down, and something new is then made from that. And in that process, time and history are encoded into the new pieces constructed. This quilt was made from homespun wool. This is in the Royal Ontario Museum collection, and this was the piece I chose to really study during my residency. It spoke to me. It looks like red, white, and blue squares, but when you go up close, you can see that the squares are actually constructed of up to 28 tiny pieces of sort of red cloth to make a square. And it just speaks to the value of cloth, how every little piece of cloth was used and valued. And this is an amazing quilt. So I also studied some of the artists in the contemporary art world who acknowledged textile in their work. Miriam Shapiro, who worked in the late 60s and early 70s, incorporated domestic textiles into her paintings. Potholders, crocheted doilies, and aprons were garnered from local secondhand shops. This was a revolutionary act at that time. And out of her work, the pattern and decoration movement in New York evolved. So as textile artists, we owe Miriam Shapiro a debt for opening up pattern and decoration. Robert Rauschenberg, who began as a clothing designer, incorporated many textiles and other found objects into his Combine paintings. There was controversy around his famous painting called Bed. Was the quilt art, or did it become art after you put paint on it? When I saw this piece in the Rauschenberg retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum, there was an old couple standing quietly next to me. At one point, the woman reached out her hand and ran it down the full length of the quilt. Touched it. Then, I couldn't believe this happened, she turned to her husband and said, "Nice quilt." I can't believe I'm standing next to and hearing this. In 1911, when Emanuel Ladnitsky was 21 years old, he stitched this quilt from suiting squares from his father's tailor's workshop. He had been told that he would never be an artist by his teachers at art school, and in an act of defiance and rage, he made this quilt, which he called Tapestry. He signed it using Man Ray for the first time as his name. So I began working on a series of quilts called Field Notes. In this series of work, I was interested in the relationship of quilts and the land. This early print shows the North American Land Survey and the grit that informs North American culture. It's the stage that we all live on and move on. And the grid survey, well, began as an idea and a logical idea. And then it became visible over time as roads were built and fields were cleared along the grid lines. So this quilt, which is about 9 feet by 9 feet, is the first quilt I made in the series. And I thought about the simplest of quilt configurations, the 4-patch, and the land that I live on, which is 4 square fields divided by 2 tree lines. The quilters finished these pieces for me, and I loved the contrast between my large, awkward stitches and their delicate, even quilting stitches. This piece is called 4-patch, hay, wheat, rye, barley. This piece is called The Moon Comes Up, The Moon Comes Down. It's about 10 feet by 10 feet. And I was just thinking about the beauty and openness of a field and the accumulation around the edges of rocks and vines and trees that were left to make the divisions. When you think of many textiles, especially carpets, the activity occurs around the borders rather than in the center. Many of the more formal textile traditions, North American quilt making, Japanese sashiko, and Indian kantha stitching, evolved out of practices of repair and reconstruction. This was the next area of study that I carried out over a period of time at the Textile Museum of Canada. I was looking for examples of mending and repair, but because this really isn't a clear area, I started by looking at samplers. These were samplers that showed how to make a darn or sew a seam or stitch a buttonhole. And they were often in long format like this and then rolled up as a kind of document or book of how to do these things. For an exhibition called In Good Repair, I decided to make my own 30-foot sampler, which is the long piece you see on the wall. Using my collection of women's handbooks and references, I endeavored to learn how to darn, mend, and patch, and make one sampler after another. I wasn't very good at it, but I loved the resulting graphic marks. Coming from a painting and printmaking background, I think about marks made with a pencil or a paintbrush and the stitched mark. The stitch is a mark with its own characteristics. The kind of stitches in women's handbooks are usually very precise, made with small muscle of the hand and made while sitting down. The physicality of a painted mark, on the other hand, can utilize the entire movement of the arm or the body. My question was, and still is, what is the nature of thread, and how can one make an energetic stitch? In an effort to give more physicality to stitching, I've tried stitching blindfolded, forming thread using gravity, and throwing thread again and again until a satisfactory configuration is arrived at. In this case, you give up your control, but you become a good editor. The sampler exhibition was shown with 2 little girls found slips mounted on light boxes on the floor. This gave an X-ray view of the extensive repair work. We called them unintended beauty. During the time that I was making the work for this show, I also kept a book of marks. This was an examination of drawn and painted marks in relation to the stitched marks. It was in the exhibition on a podium with a reading light over it so people could look through it. In working on that exhibition, it started me thinking more and more about stitching. In this detail, this is a traditional Indian kantha embroidery. During my quilt study at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, Stephen Inglis, then head of research, came in one day and handed me a printed article on kantha stitching. He said, "I think you'll be interested in this." I had never heard of kantha. That evening, reading the article, I was struck again by how cloth fragments, in this case worn out saris and dhotis, are reconstructed into something new. The red and blue selvage edges of the saris were carefully deconstructed so that the women had colored threads to stitch with. So in this you can see the red and blue threads that had been deconstructed from the selvages. The next day, Stephen came in and asked me how I liked the article. I was thrilled with the article. I don't know, it just was the right time to be given something like that. And he looked at me and said, "I think you need to go to India, and I'm going to help you go." So with the help of a research grant, I went for 2 months with Skye Morrison, who's sitting right over there, to look at kantha stitching and other Indian textile traditions. I ended up working with Aditi, a group in Bihar, who told their stories through stitching. This picture shows them discussing themes for quilts. And they did translate the song that they were singing, which was about how unfair it is that boys get to go to school and girls don't. This is an example of their stitched work. So they're solidly stitched, but they're story quilts. You see the women sitting around stitching, and you see Skye Morrison standing there taking a picture of them. They put her in the quilt. Many of the quilts were about social issues that they deal with in their lives. Here is a detail of a quilt about female infanticide. Bodies of girl babies are thrown into the Ganges River. And this quilt addresses wife earning. And a more cheerful quilt showing the use of cow dung for cooking fuel and as a building material. It's a women's material. If you've been to India, you may have seen cow patties drying on walls so that it can be used as cooking fuel and as building material. I love this whole, all these happy cows helping out. And one more quilt that they made about Toronto after they attended an opening of their exhibition, Stitching Women's Lives, which Skye Morrison and myself curated for the Textile Museum of Canada in Toronto. And this is what they thought of Toronto. They were totally ecstatic about the shiny black roads. So there's a shiny black road right through the middle of Toronto. Their roads are very dusty in India. They also were thrilled to see women driving cars. So all of the cars in this quilt have women driving them. They liked Lake Ontario, so they put some rather strange creatures in it. And maple leaves, of course, all around the edge. Just one thing, the white areas on these quilts are solidly stitched with white on white thread. So the amount of stitching in these quilts is extraordinary. Prior to working in a new place, I do research studying the people, the culture, the history of the area, and how the land is used. As well, I immerse myself in local textile traditions. I'm not sure how this research actually impacts my work, but I do know that I couldn't do my work without having that base. I had a residency in Couchcote, Newfoundland, the most easterly part of Canada. People call it the Rock, and I had imagined a cold, hard place. When I arrived, I found it to be soft with colorful ground covers and lichens. Couchcote was settled earlier than most of Canada, and prior to the grid. So patterns of settlement occurred around protective coves with roads radiating out like spokes. I really use my work as a vehicle for knowing place. When working in unknown territory, walking, observing, recording, and collecting form the basis for the work. And when I return to the studio, I use what I collected. During this residency, as a way to interact with the land, I carried wax-covered cloth with me. It was spread out on the rocks, and I scraped with a knife, picking up the rock and land textures. Later, through discharging, these patterns became visible on the cloth, and then making temporary installations with the rocks and drawing onto fabric around them, and collecting these wonderful stones with the graphic marks that are along the eastern coast of Newfoundland. When I returned to the studio in Hastings, I use these experiences to jump off from, and more finished works are created for exhibition. This exhibition was called Ground Cover. Early on, I started using a discharge technique together with wax resist to make my fabrics. Using the resulting graphic quality, I could use familiar drawn marks using janting tools, handmade printing blocks, and paint brushes. The techniques evolved slowly over time, and I started to use silkscreen more recently when I wanted to make cloth for larger pieces. This piece, which is in the Museum of Art, Boston, is called Stones from Another Place. From my studio, I see Lake Amelia. One evening, as I left the studio, the sun was setting and reflecting on the lake in such a way that it looked like a floating golden ellipse. I had never seen it that way before, and it stopped me in my tracks. I thought about how it was a bowl created by the hill coming down to form a large container. This set off a whole new body of work. This piece is called a hill, a lake. The bowl is a very powerful symbol. I thought about the large bowl created by the glaciers outside of my studio window, and the bowl on my kitchen table, the exterior landscape, and the interior domestic landscape. I'm very interested in maps and what they tell us about the land. We all carry a personal map in our heads with our own landmarks that place us and help us maneuver from place to place. The curved shape on this piece refers to the lake seen from my studio, one of my personal landmarks. Conventional maps give other information and have interesting graphic marks. This image is taken from a conventional topographical map of my lake. This piece shown in an exhibition in London is called an island pond. I had the opportunity to teach and participate in textile art conferences in Australia. This led to 8 visits over a period of 20 years. I love flying into places and seeing the human and natural marks on the land. So this is flying into Sydney. And then the up-close, intimate land, the part that you could touch with your hand or your foot. Museums are important resources for me to learn about textiles and the place. This is the Museum of Economic Botany, located in the Botanical Garden in Adelaide. It is beautifully restored with collections made by the early settlers who wondered where they were and examined the contents of the place by collecting. Collections of raw botanical material are shown, and how this plant material is used to make objects. These are Aboriginal biting bags. They are made from hand-spun grasses and colored with earth ochres. They are worn by men and are used to bite on when they are angry or have other emotional situations. So I thought these would be good to give out right now. In the course of my trips to Australia, I often heard about artists who worked on site in the outback. This became my dream, and it took years for it to finally happen. You have to know what you're doing when you head out into the desert. I met India Flint, the well-known natural dyer. She knew of a historic sheep station in the Flinders Ranges in the outback. We arranged to go there together and stay in the sheep shearers' quarters. This is what the bedrooms look like. They seem to me kind of like nuns' beds. We contemplated doing a team teaching effort, and we joked this would be the picture used to advertise our workshop, and it would serve to ward off those who wouldn't enjoy the experience. I learned from India about dyeing with eucalyptus leaves. Here is my leaf collection. There are over 100 varieties of eucalyptus, giving colors from grays to beiges to bright reds and oranges. Hanging out in the dump, I became fascinated with the shapes and colors of the metal and the objects in the dump. We discovered this dump on the station, and because we needed rust to add to the dyes, this provided us with that as well as dye pots. And I made a museum of collected metal on the front porch where we were staying. When the rancher who owned the sheep station came by in his boot and asked us what all the junk was on the front porch, I said, "Warren, this is not junk. These are historic artifacts from your farm. And by the way, what are these formed wires with the hooks on the ends that you see at the top?" I had collected quite a number of them, and you see 3 of them at the top there. He explained that when the men go out to bring the sheep in, they fashion a billy can for tea by punching 2 holes in the sides of the can, fashioning a handle made out of wire, and everything holds, and then it holds in tea. So everything holds information if you know what it is. Later, these artifacts were exhibited as part of a show. To me, it reads like lines of a mysterious language that speaks of history and place. We used India's method of tightly bundling plants, metal, and cloth, and paper. And these were cooked overnight on a fire or a stove. I was interested in learning about use of the earth ochres. So it was amazing when we found out that there was an ochre pit with a vast deposit of colorful earth pigments right on the sheep station. This is it. So this became the studio. A couple of years later, on my second visit to the Flinders Ranges, I came prepared with fabric stitched with heavily textural stitches. And I carried this out to the ochre pit, where the earth ochres were worked into the cloth using soy milk as a binder. Back home in the studio, a series of pieces were created using each of the colors from that ochre pit: red, yellow, white, purple, and pink. A knife was used to scrape and abrade the fabric, removing the earth pigment in places to expose the stitches. On another trip to the Kimberley in the northwest part of Australia, I traveled with Judith Gray and her family, who had traveled extensively and lived in the Western Desert. In the picture, I am spinning string, a technique that I learned from the Aboriginal women. String is an important component in Aboriginal textiles. It is spun from plant material and hair, and is used to make objects such as dilly bags for carrying things and ceremonial belts. Spinning string became second nature to me, and it was something I could do along long rides in the outback. With each stop, I'd rub the color of the earth from that stopping place into the string, so the string became a narrative of the trip. We camped near a water hole. Standing on the rock ledge, you can look way up and way down. I was thrilled to find iron oxide deposits at the edge of the water hole. Every day we hiked to the water hole, and this became my studio. Lovely to sit on the rocks and have everything needed right at hand. The fabric, colored with the orange earth, oxidized and turned to a rich brown color by the time I arrived home. It was used to make this piece, looking up and looking down, a 6-foot by 9-foot piece. Having worked for many years in Australia, I wanted to do a parallel project in my own country. The remote Australia outback and the Canadian Arctic are two great wildernesses that hold a place in the mythology of each country. They appear in art and literature and are part of the culture, whether or not you've actually been there. This was flying into the Pangerton in the Arctic, flying over the ice. The Arctic and the outback have many contrasts, the cold and the hot, the wet and the dry. Canada and Australia are similar in how they were settled around the edges in the case of Australia, with massive desert in the center, and along the edge in the case of Canada, with a vast wilderness to the north. Both the Arctic and the outback are technically deserts. Whether the desert or the tundra, both spaces were occupied by Europeans who claimed ownership. This picture is of Pangerton. You can see the town, the village in the distance. And I did my Arctic residency in this community. It was chosen because they have a tapestry weaving studio. This hill form appears in many of the women's tapestries woven in the studio. It is a landmark and forms an anchor for the community. Walking on the first day, I came across a children's installation made from materials at hand: seaweed, stones, wood, and metal scraps. I thought it was a beautiful installation with this poetic act of sorting stones by size. India Flint says that you will find everything you need on the land, everything you need to make your work. I was skeptical about this theory working in the Arctic. However, on the first day walking along the water's edge, I spotted a pot out in the water. By wading out into the frigid cold, I was able to retrieve what became my dye pot. I dyed Japanese paper using small quantities of plant material so as not to deplete the supply. Arctic willow gives a reddish brown color, and this plant gave a beautiful green, blue-green color. This paper was later used to construct books, and some of the collections from that residency. The duck eggs were a gift from the tapestry weavers, and the seal bones were sewn into parchment-like seaweed. When the weather allowed, I walked barefoot on the tundra. It didn't seem right to walk on this delicate land with big boots. In this cold climate, the plants survive by growing tightly together and creating a microclimate. They are old. One feels as if you are walking on a tiny, ancient forest. I am drawn to these kinds of landscapes where things struggle to survive. Pangerton is located in a fjord. In contrast to the shallow lake in the front of my studio, the landforms here form a deep, narrow container for water. It's like a large U shape made by two mountains. Back in the studio, I used that form to make the piece fjord. I like finding ways to use the qualities of the thread. Here, thread and gravity were used to make the form. It's a physical gesture where by holding the two ends of the thread and moving your hands apart, the shape of the curve can be changed. A drawing in space. The large geological shape is seen from a distance. The stitches and details seen up close relate to the intimate landscape. During the time that I was in the Arctic, it was light for 24 hours a day. People were always up. My best walking time was midnight to 3 in the morning. I never knew when to sleep. I asked the weavers at the studio, how do you know when it's night? I said, how do you know when to sleep? They said, oh, you sleep when you're tired. What a concept. The two containers in this piece made me think of the women and how they carried their babies in containers. That's part of their clothing, and how the babies sleep when they're tired. This piece is called Signs, and it contains the shapes from Australia, from the dump. There's a sister piece called Traces that was made from the Arctic. So this detail you can see, there's a rubbing of one of the rusted cans collected from the dump, and a piece of a horseshoe, and some of the wire and the billy can handles are incorporated into this piece. The work made from the outback and the Arctic residencies resulted in an exhibition called Silent Ice, Deep Patience. It had two components: the works produced in the studio and a museum area showing the processes carried out on site. This piece is called A Red Hill, a Green Hill, and it's made from Australian earth, ochres, and ink washes in the detail. And this part of the museum section containing the book forms made from the plant-dyed Japanese papers. There is also an audio box containing recorded sounds from each place. For me, the visual always overrides sound. Place is not just what you see, but what you feel on your skin, the scent in the air, and the surrounding sounds. By wearing tiny microphones in my ear, the sound was amplified and recorded at the same time. Each drawer contains objects and sounds that are heard when the drawer is opened. This is the contents of one of the drawers that is a deconstructed square foot of tundra. I brought it back to the studio and deconstructed everything that was in it. It contained a variety of plants, including tiny, tiny leaves that you see in the right-hand corner. And another drawer showing Inuit written syllabics. I thought about the language of the land, and this written language developed by a European priest and adopted by the Inuit so they could read the Bible. And this shows on the wall my collecting cards that I carry with me when I travel as part of a journal, a way to journal. They are used to pick up fragments of place. One of them really doesn't say anything, but as a group, they begin to speak to one another. So they could be plants, paintings of stones, shapes, or earth. This piece is called The History of Stone. So people sometimes comment about my work. They say you must have a lot of patience. And I know patience is not considered a virtue today, so I know it's not a compliment. I don't think of stitching as requiring patience so much as giving myself time. I like to give a piece all the time it requires to be finished. This is called The Silence of Fog. The embroidery thread remembers being wrapped around a piece of cardboard. This results in a lively quality of line. And these were some of the objects in the cases as part of the exhibition. And we see this on the left-hand side, some of the string that I spun and rubbed earth into. The top one is the Arctic, the bottom one is Australia. Yeah. And my own footprints made from walking on mud in Salt Lake. This book was carried with me on a 2-month journey through Australia. Each day, earth was rubbed, painted, or adhered to a page. It was my journal of the trip. One day, we were staying at a farm in Victoria. When I came out in the morning to collect the earth, it didn't look very colorful. But this was a journal of days, so I collected it anyway. Later, in contrast to the other warm colors, this page read as a blue-gray and was one of the most beautiful pages in the book. More recently, I have been exploring the direct application of earth ochres using a paintbrush to fabric. These are kind of small works made prior to committing to a large-scale piece. And I like the irregularities, the sign of the hand in these pieces. So to finish up, I would just like to speak a little bit about my studio. That's it. I love being in my studio. I've made it a place that I want to be. It's not just a place to make work, but a place to feed the work. It must have a comfortable chair for looking, because I spend a lot of time looking. Having things around is important to me. I struggle with procrastination, so it becomes something that is built into my working process. I practice creative procrastination. I go to the studio, I putter, perhaps I sort and fold fabric, read a relevant article, handle and arrange my collections, do some random stitching, and gradually something does begin to take shape. Keeping the Saul LeWitt quote in mind, if you're stuck, do your worst work. That's always helpful. So during COVID, I was looking at my studio, which has really become an installation that grew over 30 years. For me, it was an active and exciting space, but around my 75th birthday, I was struck by the urge to pack everything up and start from a fresh slate. I took this picture after I finished. So it was really an exercise in thinking about what is still important to me for my work and what can I let go. And my studio, this is what it looked like afterwards. It was kind of scary. Anyway, it became a white box, very scary, but also exciting in its potential to grow again and reflect new inspirations and experiences. One always imagines that starting new work will become easier, but in fact, it never does. So this is the moving forward part from the clean slate. But now it's starting to look better. I had a friend build museum drawers for me to keep my collections in, so they're all there. I can pull them out and have them right at hand whenever I want. And new things are starting to come in to the studio. It was a very good exercise. It took a long time, but I was happy with it. So this is some recent small works. I've been looking at some of the architectural shapes on the rural landscape, the roof lines. Before this, I've always looked at land forms and sort of ignored the human-built part other than what's on the land. And I'm starting to look at these wonderful corrugated metal buildings that have beautiful roof lines and no windows, so they really look like forms, sculptural forms on the land. This is called Rising Mist, and this is called rural architecture. So this is a recent commission piece, a private commission for someone in southern Italy. And I wanted to see if I could figure out a way to silk screen print with my earth pigments. So the red side, the pink side on the right, is silk screened earth pigments. So I was really happy that I figured out how to do that. So it's working with earth pigments, ink washes, and applique. And up close you can see the silk screen part and the stitched part and the applique part. So these pieces, I feel like they become quieter since my purge in my studio. There's a quietness to those pieces, new pieces. And so this is the last one. This is in the Arctic. I picked up this stone that had a wonderful stripe through it and looked across the water, and there was the hill on the other side. And I thought, what a good illustration of the close-up, intimate land that you can hold and the faraway land that you can just see.